Ever since I first heard about the conservation corridors envisioned by Ron Reed that crisscross the Couchiching region, I've wondered what it would take for an animal to actually traverse that distance. These corridors outline the most important areas of connectivity by linking together areas that are already protected in some way. After years of thinking and quite a lot of planning, I will be taking on the first section of the Minisink to Matchdash corridor. Over 3 days, I will be paddling and walking from Little Lake, just north of Barrie, to Copeland Forest. I plan on looking at the anchor points of Little Lake, Simcoe County Forest, Springwater Provincial Park, and Copeland Forest, along with the connections between them. Where I can, I will be taking the route I think wildlife would take. At other points, I will have to walk along roadsides to get between green spaces without trespassing, or to cross major roads and highways. I will document barriers, species, wildlife on roads, and get a sense of how connected it really is. I'm hoping to be able to highlight the weak and strong points within the corridors and provide an insight into the reality of what a conservation corridor actually looks like on the ground. So at the very beginning, where you do all the planning and you figure out exactly where you're going to be going, and it all seems like it's a great idea. And then the moment comes where you get dropped off on the side of the Penetanguishene Road and you just have to see where you're going to go. I had all my things, threw it all in the kayak, and just hoped that all of my planning would actually work and I'd be able to get along the whole route. And then immediately within about 50 feet, I hit a tree that's come across the river, and I have to kind of climb out, drag it through the tree, and then carry on. Quite quickly ran into a lot of stuff, but it's a barrier for me. It's not a barrier for the wildlife, so it's all good. One of the first kind of bits of wildlife that I ended up seeing was just down the river from where I started was a beaver dam crossing the river, and right behind the beaver dam was the Highway 400 where it splits with the Highway 11. And it was really interesting to kind of be on the perspective of the river looking at a wild animal habitat right there, and then right behind it was the highway. And basically at that point the river went under the bridge, and what I could see was that on either side of the river there was actually these great dry areas, so there were kind of rocks and things like that, so terrestrial wildlife would be able to use that, and then aquatic wildlife would be able to use the river. And it was actually a really great underpass, and so that was really quite exciting to see that there was a really good way for wildlife to get across that particular barrier. One of the things I did notice that there weren't things like wildlife fencing to kind of funnel the wildlife in. That's something that really is an easy fix if we're willing to do it. And that would funnel wildlife to be able to get under that bridge and use that river as a riparian corridor. So it's using it as a corridor for wildlife to actually get through. There were some really great areas. So Little Lake was really great for wildlife. There was a lot of connectivity, loads of wildlife. And then there were expected things that I thought I would see, which was some of the roads that were very obvious, the railway, with clear boundaries. Now this is where Willow Creek goes under St. Vincent Street. So this is a pretty big barrier. There's no place for wildlife to walk under the bridge. And I've seen lots of roadkill up and down this road. Turtles, mammals, frogs, lots of other things too. You can see it's a fairly busy road. One of the things I was trying to achieve with the journey was to try and find where the barriers are. So really identifying those areas where there were significant barriers that we might be able to make a change in the future. So we could reach out to the transportation companies and actually have them change culverts and things like that so that wildlife could get through rather than going over the road. Other things were to check where the green spaces were actually as good as they looked from above. Somewhere like Willow Creek going through Midhurst. In my mind, it had seemed like it would be a really great conservation corridor. Coming through the middle of Midhurst, it's this kind of green ribbon that goes right through the middle of it. And then when I went down the river, you actually realize how close people's backyards, so like mowed all the way to the edges, kind of lights, you can see where lights would be on, and kind of what looked like quite a good corridor really got narrowed in places to just a few feet on either side of the river. So it really kind of made you realize how much wildlife would really be funneled in. And just kind of experiencing that was interesting. And then kind of reaching the bridge that goes over Willow Creek in Midhurst, and how all of that wildlife would be funneled into an area of just, say, 30 or 40 feet. Most of it was just a river. And that was really quite eye-opening, just to see how narrow some of those areas were when you're actually looking at where they could go. They've only got one option. I think something that people are kind of surprised by when I talk about this is things like the zone of influence. So people forget that we have an impact that is bigger than ourselves. And also just those things that we don't consider. So we're very visual, and we see our world and we sense our world mostly through sight or sound, whereas other wildlife use different senses. So things like light pollution, which is just having lights on at night, will have a huge impact on things like migrating birds. But it's not just light pollution, it's all different kinds of pollution. So a dog lives in a world of sense. Bird lives in a world of sight and sound. Salamanders might be a lot of chemical senses that they have. They all live in very different environments and have a different view of the world. And if we can consider those, then we could better understand what things like light pollution would do to them.
This is the end of the paddle or dragging portion. So I'm gonna drop up my kayak. Becky's gonna come pick it up, and I'm gonna grab my bag, and I'm gonna get started on the walking section. Quite a bit later than I expected, so we'll see whether I have to detour to go camp or whether I can get all the way to Springwater. See how heavy this bag is. But yeah, gonna get going down the trail and see how the walking section goes.
One of the areas that I had to cross actually a couple of times was County Road 27. So that's just north of Barrie in Midhurst. And the idea behind that was to kind of show how busy that road is, and how, as someone who knows what a road is and how cars work, how long it took for me to get across, and just the care that you have to take going across there. It is a fairly busy road, and it really was quite a big barrier, and one of the ones that I really wanted to focus on when I was looking at the corridor. And something that you couldn't really tell from some of that footage was that there's also deer crossing signs at that point. So it's a known area that we know that there are wildlife trying to cross at that point. It's interesting because there's it's also like a slight hill, so you can't really see things coming from different directions. And these are things that we don't think about when we drive on a road. You're going 80 kilometers, 90 kilometers an hour, and you don't really think about just the slight incline could change the perspective of something that's trying to cross the road, especially if they're shorter. Could have something like a fox trying to cross that road. It's nerve-wracking having to try and cross a lot of that stuff. Some of it is more than others, the bigger highways, but yeah, it just makes you think more when you're trying to think of it from the perspective of an animal. You're kind of standing there looking at these cars flying by and realizing that they don't understand how they work. Some of the biggest barriers that I came across were the obvious ones, like the highways. Some of the unexpected ones were actually those areas that looked like they would be good for wildlife, but there were lots of people using them. And some of them were things like fences. So there's a lot of fences out there that cause barriers for wildlife.
So here's another pretty big barrier. We've got train tracks. There's a whole bunch of railway ties up here as well. Be really careful on that. Train tracks. Yeah, so looks like 2 lanes of train tracks. I don't know how many are actually used, but this is a really big barrier for small animals like turtles and things like that. I mean, reaching this and trying to get over a train track for a small turtle would be very difficult. In this habitat, not such a big issue, I guess, but I'm sure along many other sections of this train track they are. On the other side of these train tracks is Springwater Provincial Park. Like I said, this is a very good anchor, really important for wildlife to have provincial parks. I'm not going to go any further because I've got a long way to go and it's about to get dark. But yeah, we'll go back across the train tracks and then try and find somewhere to camp.
Day one had been a much harder day than I expected, having to kind of get through a lot of the Willow Creek with all of the trees that were down. But it was really nice to be able to get to the spot that I'd planned on going to. Definitely really tired from the day. It was a little bit more nerve-wracking than I expected, just because I was so close to the main road and it felt like I was kind of right next to it. But yeah, definitely a long day. So happy to get some sleep for the next day.
Just made it to my campsite. So, took the stuff. Stick the hammock up over there, somewhere around here. All my water stashed away, so I can use that. And yeah, made it. And it's just sun it's gonna be setting in about 10 minutes, so timing wasn't too bad. But I gotta get this stuff set up quick. Great, so campsite's all packed up. My goal today is to cross County Road 27 and then go back through Midhurst and then go to the Midhurst Community Center and then follow the Ganaraska Trail almost all the way to Horseshoe Valley Road. The first night was much colder than expected. I decided not to bring a sleeping mat, so it wasn't the best sleep. It was very loud with the road next to me. But yeah, just knowing that it was gonna be a long day of walking, so I was up early and just getting out over the road and then across into the more green spaces than I had been in the previous day. So just came from Midhurst through Simcoe County Forest. There's this big chunk of Simcoe County Forest here, and then it extends. There's a really big kind of green section that goes up here, lots of forested areas. But this is really close to a new subdivision that's going in just to the east of here. So I sent the drone up and had a quick look, and it's a really big subdivision that's going in there. And so even though it's kind of separate from this and a little bit further away, it does mean that that kind of what used to be farmland is no longer available for wildlife to move through. But also there's just going to be an increased pressure of people. Every time you get more and more people into an area and you have more people using the area, wildlife are less likely to use it. So it just kind of squeezes them into these areas that are refuges for them. One of the big takeaways from seeing what it was like on the ground in terms of there being a great green space with lots of what looked like great habitat and there being people in there and noise and motorized vehicles kind of really changing that landscape on the ground was that we could imagine that this is going to be a great corridor, but until you actually experience it, you don't actually know what it's going to be like. So there's a lot of wildlife that just would not use that in any way. And so what looks like a really great spot on a map, and we can feel really great about seeing that and saying we've connected this to that, and wildlife can just go right through. In reality, that's not happening, and it will just be overlooked. One of the things in that kind of green space was the dirt bikes that were coming around. You could hear them really far away, and there was just this kind of loud noise, and the smell of the engines really kind of made everything go quiet. So for a long time before the ATV even reached you or the dirt bike even reached you, and then a long time afterwards, there was just silence. There were no birds calling. I didn't see any wildlife. And that really shows how the zones of influence work in terms of when someone is out in nature and you could be, say, walking along on a trail, being quiet, your zone of influence, how you're influencing wildlife, might be 100 meters because they notice you, they'll go quiet, and they won't really do what they would normally do for 10 minutes or so until you walk by, and then they kind of become active again. Second day was a much longer day in terms of walking and just realizing that those big areas of green space that we thought would look good weren't quite as good as I had anticipated, but it was also very nice to be sleeping in an area that was further away from people and roads and things like that. I came across from my campsite from last night, and I'm partway to Horseshoe Valley at the moment, so I had to walk down Gill Road as well for a bit. Mostly it's been forested though, especially this last few sections. Really nice forests in here. It's big. It connects to some private land, Simcoe County Forest. I think there's some crown lands around here somewhere. So a really good, solid
point in the connection, and really exciting to kind of come through and actually check it out. And I think it's a really good part of the Minnesink Matchdash corridor. Yeah, well, for now I'm gonna make some food and get started again in the morning. So it's the beginning of the third day. Gonna be hiking out the rest of the way to Horseshoe Valley Road, and then I'll be going through down Horseshoe Valley to Craighurst and then up towards Copeland. At the last day, kind of getting up and getting ready to go, I knew I had to meet my partner. She was picking up a bunch of my stuff, so I didn't have to carry as much. So I had a bit of a deadline to get out to the road. So it was nice to kind of pack up and then just get going again. Really see the morning in that kind of an environment. I wasn't next to the road again, so it felt much nicer being in that kind of open forest area. And yeah, it was just nice to know that I was kind of on schedule. It's hard to know what the plan will be, what will turn out like once you actually get out there, but I managed to hit my goals along the way, so that was quite good. I made it to Horseshoe Valley Road. It's just over there. I can really hear the road. It's really, really busy. You can hear the highway too. I've been able to hear it for a long time. And the train. So a lot going on. But yeah, I managed to get up here and I'm just packing up my stuff for Becky to take. So I've got a lighter load for the rest of the walk. Next, I'm going to be going onto Horseshoe Valley Road, across 400, and then go up to Craighurst and then up towards Copeland. So this is probably going to be the most unpleasant part of the whole thing. So one of the big barriers that I knew I would be hitting was crossing Highway 400 along Horseshoe Valley Road. The only way that I could reasonably see that I could get across was to go on the overpass on Horseshoe Valley Road to get across that highway. I don't really know where wildlife can cross that road. Highway 400, it's split in two and it's just a really big stretch. There's fencing down there as well, which is another barrier. And it was scary for myself to get across that. It's just a very busy road. Having to cross over the bridge, I had to kind of run down the side along the concrete barrier and then run across to the other side and keep going. And that was really quite scary. There was a car that came up right next to me as I was going along, but I really don't know where wildlife would go. There's not much along that whole section of Highway 400 that looks like it's possible for wildlife. So that was one of the big areas that I knew would take a bit more kind of figuring out as to how would wildlife actually do this. I just really couldn't see a way across it that was safe or reasonable for any animal to try and cross over.
I don't see any kind of fencing or any underpass, anything like that. Just cuts right through the corridor. Yeah, so it's definitely the biggest barrier so far.
When looking at what a conservation corridor actually is, it's more of a kind of a concept. In reality, there's going to be a lot of things in the way. There's going to be fragmentation that will happen, which can be roads, it can be railways, fences in people's backyards, it's fences in fields. We can navigate that landscape very easily, but fragmentation for wildlife is a huge problem because we just kind of slice and dice the whole landscape up and don't really think about how that impacts wildlife. And if they can't reconnect through populations, you're going to have those populations will be separated and they might have genetic problems. You might have some that can't actually breed with nearby populations because of a road or a railway or something like that. So every time you see one of those human barriers that we create, that's going to fragment the landscape further and further. And the more you fragment it, the more wildlife are isolated, and those small isolated pockets will slowly die out. One of the other things that I came across when I was doing the walk was lots of culverts that we have, and we use culverts to move water from one side of a road to another, and that's all we really think of them as. But realistically, they could provide great corridors for wildlife, but they have to be built in a certain way that they can actually provide that safe passage. So one of the things is doing something like building wildlife fencing that will funnel wildlife to that culvert, and then making sure the culvert is something that they would actually go through. If it's dark and full of water, you're going to get no terrestrial wildlife going through it. So you might need to put ledges in so you'll get foxes and things like that using it. But mainly it's just a matter of building them in a way that they can be used by wildlife. Otherwise, they'll just go over the road because that's what makes sense to them. Why would you go through a dark tunnel if you could just go over a bright road? A lot of the recommendations that I looked at when I was going through and stood out to me at the end was things like retrofitting culverts so that wildlife funneled through them and can get across roads safely, or removing fencing that doesn't need to be there. So there's also just very key points along the way that would be good places to try and focus on first to increase that porous landscape. So something like the Highway 400 just as it leaves Barrie, putting in the wildlife fencing just to funnel wildlife through what's already a good culvert. And then in other places, it's kind of making changes that we know already work and we do in other places, but just making that standard. So whenever we redo a road and refit a culvert and, it needs to be replaced, just make it wildlife friendly. And it's not that hard to do, and it's much easier to do when it's being built.
There's the end over there at the highway, or just before it. So I'm just a few meters away now from the end. So yeah, pretty happy. Managed to make it all the way. But yeah, this last bit has been quite thick, but really nice to see an area with no trails. Some signs of people hunting and things like that, or some signs of people in here, but not the trails and the ATV tracks and dirt bikes and logging and all of that kind of stuff in here. So it's really nice to see just it kind of just getting on with itself.
Having gone through this whole walk, trying to view this whole corridor and this landscape through the perspective of other wildlife, the one thing that I want people to start thinking about in their own lives is, how would this space look to another species? How do they see it? How do they interact with it? And when you can think about it and empathize with how they live their lives, then you've got a much better idea of how we can make it better for them. So then we can think kind of outside of ourselves and really make it better for all the wildlife and ourselves.
So, next stage of the journey is to go under this culvert to get all the way to Matchdash.